Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of July of 2024. Today we have significant number of very interesting details and updates, so let's start. And first let's talk about Avdiivka tactical bridgehead. We got just one piece of news, probably the smallest piece of news of the previous 24 hours, but also very important. According to different mappers, the Russians resumed their offensive operation in this direction. This is not like the real offensive, it's more like attempts to maintain the line of combat contact, to shorten the lines, and to get as close as possible to the Ukrainian positions now in the fields between Urozhaina and Donetsk. So most likely during the next few weeks the Russians will be concentrated exactly on the fields with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area. Now let's move further. Let's talk about South Donetsk direction, and the most important updates during the previous 24 hours are coming from the village of Maximilianovka. This is very unique and very interesting direction because we are not receiving from this area for nothing for a very long period of time. The last update we received from this direction probably took place around the months, and there were also something like changes on the ground, but after that as complete silence for another month. And now we received another update, and according to this video we can see that the video was published by the Ukrainian forces. In this video we can see how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians inside of the village of Maximilianovka. By the evening of the 22nd of July of Moscow Ukrainian time, we managed to geolocate few strikes, few buildings. The first strike took place in this area. The second strike, FPV drone strike, took place in this area. Based on this video and these episodes, most of the mappers have adjusted their maps and added additional territory under complete Russian control. So we can, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that during the previous months the Russians were moving further in the western direction with the purpose to establish complete control over Maximilianovka, to get the eastern outskirts of the village and to begin the battle for Kurakhovo. You know that Maximilianovka is going to be very difficult, let's say, village, because it's the same, it's similar to Marinka, to Georgievka. It's a very long village, and obviously the Russians will be forced to spend a lot of time. But anyway, if the Russians are able to reach the western outskirts of the village, then they can defeat and to destroy logistic and everything they can in the southern direction. When we are talking about the towns like Konstantinovka, Vodyane, Ugledar, and Bagayavlinka. Now let's move further. Let's go to Krasnohorivka. As you can see, we have some doubts and some questions regarding these positions of armed forces of Ukraine between the fields, and today we got the video that shows us that how the Russians were bombing the Ukrainian forces inside of this area with artillery strikes, with salt flamethrower systems. This video confirms that there are still a lot of Ukrainian positions, but after the Russians captured most of Krasnohorivka and after the Russians managed to advance and to get significant progress in Maximilianovka, now we see that Ukrainians inside of these fields got encircled by the Russians, and now the Russians can start resume pressure, which will obviously force the Ukrainians to fall back from this area towards Gostre. So obviously during the next few days, maybe weeks, the Russians will maintain the line of combat contact and the Russians will take under control this territory. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Krasnohorivka itself. Right before we start making the video, we got some updates, some videos from this part of Krasnohorivka, from the most western, from the street of Slavyanska. So along this street, the Ukrainian sources published the video of how they were FPV droning the Russians. Some of the buildings were geolocated, some of them weren't. So we need more time, and probably before the next video we will adjust the map and we will show additional gains of the Russians inside of this area. Anyway, we have some videos with fire anomalies, and according to information we have, currently the main Russian goal, the main Russian focus, as well as to establish complete over Krasnohorivka, is to capture these farms. They need this area to control the Ukrainian reinforcements and reserves that are moving from, let's say, Kurakhovo towards Krasnohorivka along Dachная Street and along Schmitta Street. Maybe the Russians are planning to create another cauldron for the Ukrainians and to cut the Ukrainians completely. Who knows? But anyway, something interesting is going to happen in this direction also during the next few weeks. Now let's move to the western Avdiivka direction. We have one Leopard, one Abrams tanks that was destroyed as a result of as a result of series of Russian FPV drone strikes. Most likely the Ukrainians abandoned Abrams after a series of strikes, and then the Russians destroyed completely. So another Abrams destroyed in the western Avdiivka direction. The most important updates from this territory are coming from the area between Lazavatska and Timofeevka. Very interesting situation. We have some scenes, some photos from this direction, and according to information we have, during the previous 24 hours the Russians made first attempts to attack the Ukrainians in Timofeevka using significant number of armored vehicles and tanks. So most likely during the next video we will discuss this in details. We're going to receive additional updates, but once again, according to for now unconfirmed reports, the Russians launched their offensive to Timofeevka and using these two roads of attacks, these fields and these two lines to attack, and maybe very likely that as a result of this offensive the Russians managed to establish complete control over this territory as well. If this information is confirmed, then this is going to be another Russian significant progress in this direction, and then the Russians will be able to capture Vovchansk by attacking them from the south and from the southwest, and of course the Russians will be able to do the same from on the line of Alexandrovka Vovchansk also. So let's follow the situation. We need more details, but once again, if this information is correct, then the Ukrainians are doomed, at least on the road between Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk itself, because from this small village Fedorovka there is like almost nothing in direction of N32 road. Now let's move further. Let's talk about New York Donetsk agglomeration. We have a lot of very interesting updates and details, a lot of icons. We have already discussed the situation in this area based on many mappers. We have a lot of changes on the ground, but we have some changes in comparison with the previous video. If you remember, during the previous video we were talking about the situation in the south. According to some Russian sources, pro-Russian sources, the Russians established complete control over this territory. Furthermore, according to information we have, the two Ukrainian battalions were encircled exactly between and among these fields and the fortifications. Furthermore, according to information we have, according to different mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southwestern direction towards the village of Alexandropol. Also, in the morning, during the previous updates, we talked that the Russians managed to improve their positions in the central part of Novgorodsk of New York, and by the beginning of 22nd of July of the local time, the Russians established control over every single position, every single building that lays, let's say, below this red line. So this territory was captured by the Russians by the morning of the 22nd of July. But according to information we have, according to different mappers, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions further. The Russians managed to cross Zalizna Balka, this small river, and to establish complete control over the buildings and some buildings, trees, some constructions, some fortifications of armed forces of Ukraine on the Ukrainian side of this small river Zalizna Balka. And by the beginning of this video, by the beginning I start making the video, the Russians were controlling this small block as well. Obviously significant progress, and we will discuss why this progress is so significant. Once again, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions also to the south of the city of the village Pivdinne and Zalizne, and the Russians captured the landfill, the Russians captured these trees, this forest, the Russians captured this part of residential area of the city of Zalizne. And now we can calculate the distance, and once again we have also a video of how the Russians were conducting artillery preparation, and they were bombing these fortifications, probably with the purpose to capture them. And this video was geolocated. The Russians were bombing this Ukrainian stronghold. So summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that from the southern part we see how the Russians were moving, and most likely tomorrow, before the next video, we will see probably these changes on the ground, at least that will be published by different mappers. And from this perspective, we can start calculating the distance. And according to just simple things, we see that the current distance between Russian forces in the south and Russian forces in the north is less than 3.9 kilometers. So it's nothing already. And the Russians from the northern part just need to control the area in the vicinity of these lakes and the river Zalizne. The Russians need just to control the residential part, because the Ukrainians, will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to evacuate from this territory. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainian commanders decided to stand, to fight, not to fight. It's not fighting. The Ukrainians decided not to evacuate personnel and soldiers from this cauldron, and they decided to stay there. The thing is that currently this is the only reason how to survive in this war between Russia and Ukraine, to surrender. Surrendering is the only option for the Ukrainians how to survive. So that's why these two battalions, commanders of these two battalions, decided to stand there, and when everything will be completed, when the encirclement will be completed, the Ukrainians most likely will surrender. Maybe these are just the rumors or something like this. Anyway, tomorrow or the day after, we're going to receive if the Ukrainians are going to surrender. Obviously, we're going to see this information, because there are around 2 battalions inside of this cauldron. Now let's move further. Let's talk about Chasiv Yar. There are still heavy clashes on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk Donbass Canal, but we haven't received any details about where exactly the clashes are taking place. Now let's talk about these movements to Grigorovka. According to information we have, according to different pro-Ukrainian neutral mappers, the Russians managed to improve their positions as well, and they got as close as possible to the village of Grigorovka. Now let's talk about Sivers's direction. As you can see, there are a lot of icons in this area. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions and the forces in this direction. Yet the Russians haven't conducted even a single attempt to attack in this area. There are very heavy clashes along the line of combat contact, but most likely the Russians are preparing the foothold, preparing by bombing Ukrainian positions, and most likely very soon they will resume their attempts to move further in Sivers's direction, because the Russians are advancing everything, and it seems that everything has already fallen. And now let's talk about north in Kupiansk direction. We have lots of very interesting updates from this territory as well. According to information we have, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village of Sinkovka. We got this report right before we start making the video. Some pro-Russian sources reported that the village was captured completely. We can't say that this source is 100% reliable, but we can say that this source is more or less reliable, and some reports from this source in the past were more or less correct. So, according to some pro-Russian sources summarizing everything, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians established complete control over this territory, which is obviously significant progress from the Russian side. And now the way to attack Petropavlovka, to start offensive operation towards Kupiansk, is ready and is open. Most likely during the next days, the Russians will try to improve their positions in the forest that located to the southwest of the village of Liman Pershi. They just need to secure the flanks and not to allow the Ukrainians to attack the Russians from behind. And as soon as the Russians are able to get the Oskol river along this part of the river, then they will begin storming Kupiansk and Kupiansk agglomeration from the north. Furthermore, I'll remind you that according to information we have, after the Russians captured Peshchane, the first reconnaissance and sabotage groups, sabotage forces, diverse and sabotage groups of Russian forces have already reached the outskirts of the villages like Glushavka and Kruglakovka. So the Russians are already operating there, trying to hunt and to destroy the Ukraine's supply roads, single machines, single cars, vehicles, and so on. Obviously, after a few days of such a preparation, such activity, the Russians will begin their main offensive with the purpose to cut the northern part of Kupiansk from the southern part. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are trying to dig in deeper in these 3 strongholds. As you can see, there are 3 high-rise building areas in the village of Novoasinova, as close as possible to Kupiansk and Kupiansk-Uzlovoy. During the previous 24 hours, we got another video how the Russians were trying to destroy once again the bridge. Maybe it's an old video because during the previous months, previous half year, we received dozens of videos of how the Russians were bombing exactly this bridge. Maybe it's the same, I'm not sure. Anyway, we have also additional report from the Stepovo-Novoselivka, Kislovka, Kotlerovka, Tabaevka. From this, let's say this is the northern flank, this is the southern flank. We see activity, we see Russian progress on both directions, and we have significant progress of the Russians in the vicinity of Stepovo-Novoselivka, at least according to pro-Russian sources. Summarizing everything, let's take a look at the map once again. According to information we have, as a result of clashes during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to establish complete control over these territories, or let's say on Kupiansk direction. This is another significant progress from the Russian side. They're getting closer and closer to Kupiansk itself, and obviously we can make a conclusion that Kupiansk is going to be maybe not the final battle of the summer military campaign, but this is going to be the main battle of early autumn or middle autumn military campaign. And not just Kupiansk. I think that during the summer the Russians will try to achieve as much as possible in Donetsk New York agglomeration. The Russians, as you can see, are getting closer and closer to Kurakhovo. Obviously, Krasnohorivka will be captured by the Russians during this phase of the special military operation, during the summer military campaign, and maybe the Russians will be able to establish physical control over the main supply road that goes from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka. We are talking about this N32 road. Anyway, the progress is significant from the Russian side. We see that the Ukrainians can't do anything with the Russians. They can't show them any resistance. The Russians have complete superiority in long range, middle range, missiles, air defense, aviation, aircrafts, infantry, tanks, FPV drones, in everything. The Ukrainians can't do anything. Maybe the Ukrainians do have a spirit and willing to continue fighting with the Russians, but the political situation in the world is that every single person who started this special military operation on the Ukrainian side, we are not talking about countries, we are talking about politicals. Most of them have lost their positions and were thrown to the garbage of history, and completely new people are coming to its force, and Zelensky is going to have to start negotiation with every single one from the beginning, which is obviously require a lot of significant time, and Zelensky and Ukraine doesn't have this time. Now let's talk about Vovchansk direction. We have additional changes on the ground. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions and to capture additional line of buildings along Korolenko Street, but on the Ukrainian side of this street. In this video we can see the process how the Russians were storming a serious group of basements in this direction. The Russians were throwing grenades inside of the basements, trying to clear the area. As a result of clashes, the Russians captured a small block. Of course, it's nothing in comparison with the entire north of Vovchansk, but the Russians slowly, step by step, are moving in the southern direction. Also, we have some videos of how the Russians were bombing the concentration of Ukrainian forces in the southern part of the north of Vovchansk. So, regarding the posts from the Ukrainian side and slow progress from the Russian side, we can see that there is a progress and that the situation slowly but step by step is developing in Russian favor. The Ukrainians, I don't know what are they doing. In this video we can see another missile strike and aviation strike in the village of Tikhe, and as we discussed in the previous updates, according to information we have, the Russians brought additional reinforcements in reserve in the vicinity of Vovchansk, and the Ukrainian military experts are expecting that the Russians are about to resume and to renew their attempts to capture this stronghold with significant number of forces. And as I understand, the Russians are planning to attack the Ukrainians using the foothold that they managed to establish on the Ukrainian side of Seversky Donetsk River. And most likely the Russians are planning to attack in direction of Sinelnikovo, and then in direction of Tsegelny, and then to Vilcha. It's going to be very difficult, obviously very difficult operation, but if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory, then they will be able to create another cauldron, but this time in Vovchansk. The Ukrainians will be forced to fall back. If they are not going to fall back, then the Russians can begin offensive toward Tikha and Vovchansky Hutory, and by attack in this direction, the cauldron will be established complete, and then this is going to be another disaster for the armed forces of Ukraine. So let's wait what is going to be next, but something tells me that this is exactly what is going to happen during the next months, and also by the end of the summer military campaign. As for Glubokhy northern Kharkiv direction, we just have few videos of how the Russians were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions inside of Liptsy with the FAB 3000 and FAB 1500. According to information we have, according to the report of the Group of Forces North, as a result of these strikes, the Russians managed to destroy a significant number of soldiers from the 30th Brigade of National Guard. So this is obviously we see that the front line is breathing, that the front lines are breathing, that everything is very difficult and complicated, and the sources are saying that in the future everything is going to be much worse. Furthermore, we have probably one of the most important updates during the previous 24 hours. Of course, all these things are important. Progress in Maximilianovka, attack towards the village to the west of Novoalexandrovka, the encirclement of the Ukrainians in Novgorodska, the attack towards Grigorovka, the complete collapse of Ukrainian defense in northern Kupiansk direction, additional reinforcements in Vovchansk. All these updates are very important, but another important thing is that the Russians began their clearing island operation. According to different mappers, the Russians managed to secure the islands between Krynki, Kazachye, Lahiri and Ukrainian bank of the river. So, summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that this territory is already under complete Russian control. And the question is why the Russians are doing this, because it's very risky. It's very risky to stay among the islands, because islands are not protected by FP drones, by electronic warfare. So you can risk and you can lose lots of manpower, as Ukrainians used to lose during the battle for Krynki. Now the Russians are in the same position. And the only explanation we have about this situation is that some Ukrainian sources also reported that maybe the Russians are planning to cross Dnipro River, because this is the best bridgehead, best position, best area to do this, and just to establish control over some villages in, let's say, on this side, to capture like Novotyagинka, Tyagинka, Ivanovka, to capture this territory and to force the Ukrainians to collapse completely. Because if the Russians are able to do this, this is going to be obviously significant media victory that Ukrainians haven't managed to do and the Russians managed to do, and this is going to be not something like very important. The Russians are not planning to develop this foothold further, but as a part of media victory, this is going to be significant. And that's it for this video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.